Chapter 1. I didn't even want to say it like that at first because it sounds harsh, and I'm not trying to sound bitter or dramatic, but the truth is I started noticing patterns. Not one woman, not two. Patterns. And once you see patterns, you can't unsee them. You stop reacting emotionally and start observing. You stop arguing with behavior and start recognizing structure. And that's where things get interesting, because most men stay stuck at the reaction level. You've probably been there before. A woman pulls back slightly, and you feel it immediately. You don't even know what changed, but something did. The tone shifts, the energy shifts, and your first instinct is to adjust yourself. You text more carefully, you soften your tone, you try to be more agreeable. You think if you calibrate perfectly, you can regain whatever moved. That instinct right there is where most men lose leverage without even realizing it. One of the first weaknesses you have to understand is this need for validation through emotional certainty. Not in a cruel way, not in a mocking way, but in a human way. Most women are deeply affected by how they are perceived by a man they value. If she senses that your perception of her has shifted, even slightly, it unsettles her more than she'll ever admit. And most men never use that awareness correctly because they panic before they observe. Think about it. The moment you start over-explaining yourself, trying to prove your loyalty, trying to reassure her that you're still invested, you remove the tension. You give her certainty without requiring effort. Certainty without effort lowers value perception. That's not gendered. That's human psychology. But women, especially in dating dynamics, respond strongly to shifts in emotional positioning. You've seen it in subtle ways. The day you stop complimenting her constantly. The day you don't immediately respond. The day you don't overreact to something she says. There's a slight change in her behavior. She leans in a little. She tests a little. She tries to read you. And it's not because she's malicious. It's because your approval carries weight when it isn't automatic. Another layer that men ignore is competition anxiety. You don't even have to actively entertain other women. The mere perception that you are capable of attracting them changes her energy. When she believes you have options, she behaves differently. When she believes you're fixated solely on her, regardless of her effort, her urgency drops. That's uncomfortable to accept, but if you've lived long enough, you've seen it play out. There was a time when I watched this happen in real time. A friend of mine was dating someone casually. He liked her more than he admitted. He texted first, initiated plans, made himself fully available. She enjoyed the attention but never quite matched it. Then something changed. He got busy, not as a tactic, just life. He stopped centering her schedule. He didn't announce it. He simply moved. Within weeks, she was initiating more than he was, not because he manipulated her, because the dynamic shifted from guaranteed attention to earned attention. That shift triggered something in her that effort alone never did. You have to understand that women are highly sensitive to emotional positioning. If they feel slightly above you in investment, they relax. If they feel slightly below you, they lean in. That imbalance, even by a small margin, changes behavior. And most men operate from overinvestment early, which places them lower in the dynamic before anything meaningful has even developed. Another weakness that shows up consistently is attraction to mystery. Not mystery as in secrets or games, mystery as in emotional restraint. If she can fully read you within days, if she knows exactly how much you like her, exactly how committed you are, exactly how you'll respond in every situation, tension fades. Humans are wired to chase incomplete narratives. When the narrative feels finished too early, curiosity dies. You've probably experienced the reverse. The woman who wasn't fully transparent emotionally at first. The one who gave just enough interest but not certainty. It kept you thinking, kept you slightly unsettled, and that unsettled feeling wasn't hatred, it was curiosity. That same psychological lever exists in reverse. When you show everything immediately, you remove curiosity. When you pace your emotional availability, you create it. There's also a deep sensitivity to status perception. And I don't mean money or fame exclusively. Status in the room, status in conversation, status in self-control. If you're easily rattled, easily jealous, easily offended, it lowers perceived status. If you remain steady, especially under light testing, it raises it. Women are acutely aware of how you handle pressure. Your reaction tells her more about you than your resume ever could. You might be thinking this sounds manipulative. It's not. It's awareness. The problem isn't that women have weaknesses. The problem is men are blind to them and then shocked by the results. If you don't understand emotional triggers, you'll keep reacting to them instead of leading through them. Another vulnerability that quietly shapes behavior is emotional security. If she feels completely secure that you won't leave, won't withdraw, won't change, regardless of her effort, her urgency decreases. If she feels that maintaining connection requires consistency on her part, she invests more. This doesn't mean threatening to leave. It means genuinely being willing to walk away if standards aren't met. That internal willingness alters how you move, and she feels it immediately. You can test this in your own history. Think about when you were overly available, when you tolerated behavior you shouldn't have, when you kept giving without reciprocation. Did attraction grow or shrink? Now think about when you pulled back calmly and re-centered yourself. What happened then? The pattern is usually consistent, even if you don't like admitting it. Women are also deeply influenced by how they feel around you, not just how they feel about you. If you create an environment where she feels slightly uncertain but safe, slightly challenged but respected, slightly observed but not controlled, attraction stabilizes. If you create an environment where she feels fully in control emotionally, fully certain of your devotion without earning it, that spark dulls. Again, this isn't cruelty. It's emotional physics. The reason most men struggle with this is because they're taught to overperform, overexpress, overcommit early. They believe transparency equals attraction. In long-term relationships, transparency is powerful. In early dynamics, too much too fast removes polarity. Polarity isn't conflict. It's tension between two stable centers. If one center collapses into the other, polarity disappears. And here's something that will probably make some of you uncomfortable. Women are highly responsive to leadership energy, not dominance, not control. Leadership, the ability to decide, the ability to set direction, the ability to remain calm when things are uncertain. When you hesitate excessively or seek constant validation for decisions, you reduce that leadership perception. When you move with quiet conviction, even if imperfectly, it increases. If you're still listening at this point, it's because you've probably sensed some of this before, but never framed it clearly. Drop a comment if you've noticed behavior change the moment you stop chasing. Not to prove me right. To prove to yourself that this isn't theory. It's lived experience. This chapter isn't about villainizing women. It's about recognizing emotional leverage points that exist, whether you acknowledge them or not. The men who understand them don't become cruel. They become calibrated. They stop overreacting. They stop overgiving. They start observing. And observation is where power quietly returns. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into how emotional testing works, why it happens, and why most men fail it without even knowing they were being evaluated. Chapter 2. You don't realize you're being tested because it never feels like a test. It feels like a random comment, a mood swing, a subtle jab that could be interpreted 100 different ways. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes it effective. Because if she outright said, "I'm testing your emotional stability right now," you would adjust consciously. But that's not how it works. It comes disguised as tone, as timing. as small disruptions that don't seem big enough to confront, yet feel just big enough to shift something inside you. You've experienced it. She teases you in front of people in a way that's slightly disrespectful, but framed as playful. She mentions another guy casually and watches your face for a flicker. She delays responding and then returns as if nothing happened. None of these are catastrophic. They're small, but they're not random. They are observations. She's measuring how grounded you are. Most men fail here not because they're weak, but because they're unaware. They respond instinctively instead of intentionally. A slight jab hits their ego, and they overcorrect. They get defensive. They try to assert dominance verbally. Or they become overly reassuring, trying to prove their value in that moment. Both reactions signal instability, and instability lowers attraction faster than almost anything else. There's a vulnerability women have around consistency. Not consistency in texting or gifts, emotional consistency. If she senses that your mood is easily dictated by her behavior, she feels powerful but not secure. That sounds paradoxical, but it's true. Power without security creates anxiety. She might enjoy triggering reactions temporarily, but long-term attraction requires knowing you aren't easily shaken. Think about a moment when someone tried to provoke you and you didn't bite. Not because you were suppressing emotion, but because you genuinely didn't feel threatened. That energy changes the entire exchange. It removes the drama. It removes the tension in a way that feels stable, not dismissive. Women notice that stability immediately. It registers on a level deeper than logic. There's also the subtle weakness around admiration. Women want to admire the man they're with. If admiration fades, respect follows. But admiration cannot be forced through words. It's cultivated through composure, decisiveness, and controlled indifference to minor disruptions. The moment you start arguing to defend your value, admiration weakens. The moment you remain steady without needing to prove anything, it grows. You've probably been in a situation where you over-explained yourself during conflict. You wanted her to understand your perspective completely. So you talked longer, explained deeper, repeated yourself. And instead of feeling heard, you felt smaller by the end of it. That shrinking sensation wasn't imagined. When you over-justify, you subconsciously lower your perceived authority in the interaction. Men underestimate how deeply women are affected by perceived scarcity. If she believes your attention is abundant and guaranteed, she relaxes into it. If she believes your attention is selective and not easily obtained, she values it differently. Scarcity doesn't mean playing hard to get. It means genuinely having a life that doesn't revolve around her validation. There's a difference between being busy and being fulfilled. Women can sense when you're pretending to be unavailable versus when you genuinely have priorities. Authentic purpose creates natural scarcity, and that natural scarcity triggers pursuit instinct without you having to manufacture anything. You might resist this because it sounds like strategy, but pause and think about your own behavior. Have you ever been more interested in someone who wasn't overly accessible? Have you ever valued someone more because you felt their time was limited? That reaction isn't gendered, it's human. Women just tend to respond more visibly to it in dating dynamics. Another emotional blind spot shows up around accountability. Women are highly sensitive to how you enforce boundaries. If she crosses a line and you tolerate it repeatedly, she unconsciously lowers respect. If she crosses a line and you calmly correct it without drama, respect stabilizes. The key is calmness. Anger signals insecurity. Silence without resentment signals strength. There's a weakness tied to emotional intensity as well. Many women confuse intensity with depth. If you respond intensely to everything, she experiences emotional spikes that feel passionate at first, but exhausting later. If you regulate intensity and respond proportionally, she experiences steadiness. That steadiness becomes addictive because it feels rare. You don't have to dominate every interaction. You don't have to win every disagreement, but you do have to remain internally centered. The moment you start chasing emotional reassurance, the dynamic flips, and that flip happens quickly. Let me bring this into something more tangible. Imagine you're out together and someone compliments her. You could react with subtle jealousy. You could joke defensively. Or you could smile, unbothered, because her attractiveness doesn't threaten your position. That unbothered energy communicates more value than any possessive statement ever could. Now imagine she tries to spark jealousy by mentioning someone else's interest in her. If you react with visible insecurity, you validate the tactic. If you remain composed and shift the conversation naturally, you remove its power. Over time, she stops testing what doesn't produce reaction. She leans into what feels stable instead. There's something deeply attractive about a man who cannot be emotionally manipulated easily. It signals maturity, it signals strength, and more importantly, it signals that his value isn't contingent on external validation. That self-containment triggers both comfort and curiosity. I want you to reflect on your last disagreement with a woman. Did you escalate emotionally, or did you regulate? Did you try to win, or did you stay steady? That reflection alone will show you where you stand. If this resonates, let me know in the comments, because awareness is the first shift. You can't adjust what you don't observe. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming centered. Coldness repels. Centeredness attracts. There's a subtle but critical difference. Centered men don't chase approval. They don't panic under light pressure. They don't scramble to fix every microtension. They allow space. And space is where attraction often regenerates. The deeper realization here is that many of the so-called weaknesses aren't flaws. They're psychological reflexes. The mistake men make is either exploiting them aggressively or ignoring them entirely. The balanced approach is understanding them without becoming controlled by them, and the moment you stop reacting impulsively, you'll notice something shift. The energy changes, the tone softens. She leans in slightly more. Not because you demanded it, because you became harder to destabilize. That's where the real leverage begins. Chapter 3. There's a quiet moment that happens before she pulls away, and most men miss it because they're still trying to win something that hasn't even been threatened yet. It's subtle. She doesn't argue. She doesn't announce dissatisfaction. She just adjusts. Slightly less enthusiastic, slightly less responsive, slightly less invested. And if you're paying attention, you can feel it before you can explain it. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition. One of the most overlooked vulnerabilities women have is internal comparison. They are constantly comparing their emotional experience with you against what they believe they could experience elsewhere. Not necessarily with a specific man, with an idea, an imagined scenario, a projection built from social media, conversations, past experiences, or attention they receive in public. That comparison loop runs quietly in the background, and when it leans away from you, investment starts fading. This doesn't mean she's malicious. It means she's human. And because many women grow up receiving external validation consistently, the contrast between what feels exciting and what feels stable becomes a source of tension. Stability without stimulation can feel dull. Excitement without stability feels dangerous. The vulnerability sits right there in that balance. If you become overly predictable emotionally, not stable but predictable, the comparison shifts. Predictable means she knows exactly what you'll say, how you'll react, and that you'll remain regardless of her effort. That certainty lowers perceived value. Stable means you are consistent in your character, but not overly available in your emotional output. There's space in stability. There's breathing room. Predictability feels closed. Stability feels grounded. You might have noticed how quickly attraction can fade once you show all your cards too early. You confess deep feelings within weeks. You reveal long-term plans. You speak as if the relationship is already defined. And instead of feeling secure, she feels slightly trapped. Not by you directly, but by the weight of certainty before emotional depth has matured. That pressure pushes her into comparison mode. The weakness here is not that women compare. It's that comparison creates doubt. And doubt, when fed, grows. If she believes she could experience stronger emotional intensity elsewhere, even temporarily, her investment wavers. If she believes your presence offers something rare, something difficult to replace, comparison loses power. You don't create rarity through arrogance. You create it through composure, purpose, and selective availability. When you center your life around your mission, your growth, your path, you become less replaceable. Not because you demand it, because your energy isn't generic, it's directional. Directional energy feels different than attention energy. There's another vulnerability tied to perceived emotional depth. Women often equate emotional responsiveness with connection. If you mirror every emotion immediately, if you validate every concern instantly, she may feel heard but not challenged. Emotional challenge, when healthy, deepens connection. It forces introspection. It invites growth. Over-validation, ironically, flattens depth. Let me tell you a story. And this is the only one I'll use because it captures this entire idea better than theory ever could. I once dated someone who seemed completely invested early on. She initiated, she planned, she expressed interest clearly. I didn't overextend, I didn't underperform. I remained steady. Months passed smoothly. Then slowly, something shifted. No dramatic conflict, just small reductions in enthusiasm, fewer spontaneous calls, slightly delayed responses. When I asked casually if everything felt aligned, she said yes, but her energy said something else. Instead of chasing clarity, instead of demanding reassurance, I adjusted inward. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't accuse. I simply recentered my time and focus. I stopped structuring my week around her schedule. I returned to projects I had paused. I reduced overcommunication naturally. Within weeks, she leaned back in. Not dramatically, gradually, more effort, more curiosity, more investment. Later, she admitted she felt like I was pulling away, which made her reassess her own investment. I wasn't playing a game. I was refusing to overcompensate for shifting energy. And that refusal exposed the vulnerability. The moment she sensed she could lose access to my presence, comparison flipped in my favor. The lesson wasn't manipulation, it was alignment. When energy decreases, don't compensate disproportionately. When you overcompensate, you confirm replaceability. When you stay aligned with your purpose, you remind her that your value doesn't collapse under emotional fluctuation. Women are highly responsive to emotional consequence, not punishment, consequence. If her effort drops and your effort remains unchanged or increases, imbalance forms. If her effort drops and your effort recalibrates proportionally, balance restores itself. That proportional adjustment communicates awareness without confrontation. Another quiet vulnerability is future uncertainty. Many women crave security but are also intrigued by momentum. If your life trajectory feels stagnant, comparison intensifies. If your life trajectory feels upward, even modestly, she perceives growth. Growth reduces comparison because it signals future value expansion. Stagnation amplifies doubt. You don't need to be wealthy. You don't need to be famous. You need trajectory, movement, intentional direction. That forward momentum makes it harder for her to imagine a superior alternative because you're evolving. Evolution is magnetic. I want you to think about times when you felt taken for granted. Were you overly consistent regardless of effort? Were you hyper-available? Were you trying to maintain something instead of building yourself? That reflection matters. Because attraction isn't maintained through maintenance alone. It's maintained through continued self-elevation. If this resonates with something you've lived, take a second and comment your experience. Not for validation, for clarity. Patterns become visible when we articulate them, and when patterns are visible, decisions become sharper. There's something else happening beneath all of this. Women are often drawn to emotional gravity. Gravity is not loud. It doesn't chase. It doesn't plead. It doesn't spike emotionally at every shift. It pulls steadily, quietly. When you embody that gravity, comparison weakens because your presence feels grounded. When you embody neediness, comparison strengthens because alternatives appear equally accessible. The hard truth is that many men try to make women miss them through dramatic exits or overt displays. But the real shift happens when your absence feels consequential, because your presence carried weight. If your presence was light and overly accommodating, absence doesn't register deeply. If your presence was steady and self-contained, absence echoes longer. And this realization isn't about controlling anyone. It's about reclaiming internal alignment. The more centered you are, the less reactive you become. The less reactive you become, the more stable attraction remains. Because instability fuels doubt, and doubt fuels comparison. You don't have to compete loudly. You have to remain internally strong enough not to compete at all. That's where the shift begins. Chapter 4. There's a moment when you realize it was never about convincing her. It was about becoming the kind of presence that doesn't need convincing. That shift feels subtle at first, almost uncomfortable, because it forces you to stop performing. And a lot of men are performing without knowing it. Performing confidence, performing indifference, performing control. But underneath it, they're still hoping she chooses them. One of the deeper weaknesses women carry is fear of irrelevance, not publicly, not socially, emotionally. If she senses that her presence in your life does not shift your direction, your focus, or your emotional balance, something inside her tightens. That tightening isn't anger. It's awareness. Awareness that she isn't central. And that awareness forces her to reevaluate her position. Most men misunderstand this and try to weaponize it aggressively. They create jealousy. They flaunt options. They stage detachment theatrically. That doesn't create value. It creates chaos. The real leverage comes from authenticity. If your life genuinely continues in strength regardless of who enters or exits, she feels that difference. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's calm. You've probably noticed how attraction shifts when a man appears fully centered in himself. Not dismissive, not distant, just centered. His mood doesn't hinge on text response times. His plans don't collapse because she's unavailable. His sense of self doesn't fluctuate based on her approval. That centeredness triggers something instinctual. It feels secure but not submissive. It feels steady but not predictable. There's also a vulnerability tied to emotional hierarchy. Women often subconsciously assess where they sit in your priority structure. If she senses she's at the top regardless of effort, urgency fades. If she senses she has to maintain alignment to remain close to that top tier, she invests more. It's uncomfortable to accept because it sounds transactional, but it's deeply psychological. You don't have to say she's not your priority. You don't have to play cold. You simply need visible purpose beyond her. When your ambition, discipline, friendships, and commitments hold equal or greater weight, she recognizes that your life isn't orbiting around her existence. That recognition changes behavior. It doesn't always produce dramatic reaction. Sometimes it produces quiet recalibration. And here's something that men rarely consider. Women are highly attuned to subtle emotional shifts. If you internally detach even slightly, she senses it before you verbalize it. That sensitivity is powerful, but it's also a vulnerability. Because once she senses emotional distance, she often moves to close it, especially if she values you. If she doesn't value you, she drifts further. Either outcome reveals truth quickly. The mistake men make is announcing their detachment. They say things like, "I'm not going to chase you," or "I'm done putting in effort." That announcement removes the quiet gravity of realignment. When you speak it, you weaken it. When you embody it silently, it strengthens. There's a deeper layer underneath this. Women are often drawn to men who can regulate their emotional world independently. If you need her reassurance to feel grounded, the dynamic tilts. If you are grounded without her reassurance, she relaxes into that stability. It creates polarity without conflict. You've probably experienced a situation where a woman pulled back, and instead of collapsing inward, you focused on your own growth. Maybe you started training harder. Maybe you reconnected with projects. Maybe you deepened your discipline. That internal redirection changes your aura. And aura isn't mystical. It's behavioral consistency aligned with purpose. When she sees that shift, she doesn't always articulate it, but she feels it. There's a weakness tied to emotional volatility as well. Many women struggle with regulating intense emotional waves. If you mirror volatility with volatility, the relationship becomes chaotic. If you respond to volatility with composure, you stabilize the environment. Over time, that composure becomes addictive, because chaos feels exhausting and stability feels rare. Another subtle point is that women are often drawn to men who challenge them gently, not through criticism, through expectation. If you expect more from her without hostility, she often rises. If you expect nothing and accept everything, she often declines. Expectation signals value. Acceptance without standard signals desperation. You don't need to demand perfection, you need to communicate that your presence requires alignment. That alignment isn't about obedience, it's about mutual investment. When she senses you will walk away from misalignment calmly, she recalibrates her effort. And here's where the realization deepens. Many men think making a woman miss them is about absence. It's not. It's about weight. If your presence carries weight, absence echoes. If your presence was light and overly accommodating, absence barely registers. Weight is built through steadiness, boundaries, ambition, and emotional restraint. If you've ever disappeared briefly from someone's life and noticed their sudden interest spike, you've felt this effect. But that spike isn't sustainable if it's built on theatrics. It becomes sustainable when your entire life structure reflects non-dependence. Take a moment to consider how you respond when attention shifts away from you. Do you chase it? Do you attempt to restore it immediately? Or do you continue forward unaffected? That reaction alone determines whether she feels urgency or relief. And urgency, when balanced, sustains attraction. You might feel resistance hearing this because it challenges the romantic narrative that love should be unconditional and constant. But attraction operates differently than love. Attraction requires polarity. It requires tension. It requires subtle distance within connection. Without that tension, things flatten. If you're still here listening carefully, that tells me you've sensed some of this already. Go ahead and share this with someone who keeps over-investing emotionally too early, not to shame them, to wake them up. Because once you understand this, you can't go back to performing for approval. There's something powerful about realizing you don't need to convince anyone of your value. You only need to embody it consistently. Women respond to embodiment more than explanation. Explanation feels defensive. Embodiment feels confident. And the more you internalize that, the less you scramble when energy shifts. You observe. You adjust proportionally. You remain grounded. That grounded energy is what makes her question whether she might lose something rare. And that question is where missing begins. Chapter 5. You start to notice something different the moment you stop trying to create reaction and start becoming unmoved by it. Not indifferent in a cold way, just unmoved. There's a calm that settles in when you realize attraction is less about performance and more about position. And position is internal before it is external. If your internal position is shaky, no tactic will save you. If it's steady, you barely need tactics at all. The final layer of this whole realization is that most of what makes a woman miss you isn't what you do to her. It's what you stop doing for her. The over-texting, the constant reassurance, the emotional overexposure. When you remove excess effort without removing warmth, something shifts. The dynamic breathes again. And in that space, she feels the difference. Women are deeply sensitive to energy withdrawal when that energy previously carried weight. If your presence felt grounding, purposeful, slightly scarce, its absence becomes noticeable. But if your presence was needy, overly accommodating, or desperate for affirmation, absence feels like relief. That contrast is uncomfortable, but it's honest. You have to decide which category you've been operating in. There's also a quiet weakness around perception of loss. Humans value what feels at risk. Women are no exception. If she senses she can lose access to your emotional leadership, your stability, your trajectory, she begins recalibrating her effort. But if she senses you will remain regardless of her behavior, recalibration never occurs. Risk fuels appreciation. Safety without standard breeds complacency. You don't create risk through threats. You create it through authenticity. If you are genuinely willing to walk away from misalignment, you move differently. Your tone changes. Your patience shifts. Your reactions soften because you're not clinging. That willingness to leave isn't loud. It's quiet. And quiet confidence often carries more weight than dramatic declarations. There's something else you probably haven't considered. Women often test subconsciously because they want reassurance of strength, not reassurance of affection. Strength. They want to know you won't crumble under light pressure. When you pass those tests calmly, their internal respect increases. Respect stabilizes attraction. Without respect, attraction flickers unpredictably. You've seen this in real time. The man who remains composed during conflict commands different energy than the one who pleads for understanding. The man who continues progressing regardless of emotional turbulence feels different than the one who pauses his growth to fix every disruption. That difference is subtle but powerful. And here's where everything circles back. Making a woman miss you badly isn't about absence as punishment. It's about presence with weight. If your presence carried intention, ambition, boundaries, and restraint, your absence amplifies it. If your presence was overly accessible and emotionally reactive, absence feels like silence rather than loss. You might think this sounds calculated. It isn't. It's disciplined. Discipline in emotion. Discipline in availability. Discipline in reaction. The more disciplined you are, the less you chase outcomes. And the less you chase outcomes, the more naturally attraction sustains itself. Think about the last time someone truly missed you. It wasn't because you begged them to, it was because your presence shifted their emotional landscape. You created comfort, tension, stability, unpredictability, and balanced measure. That balance is rare, and rarity creates value. Now ask yourself honestly, when you interact with women, are you trying to impress or are you simply aligned? Impression fades, alignment remains. Women sense alignment instinctively. It shows up in posture, in pacing, in how quickly you respond, in what you tolerate. It's not something you announce, it's something you live. If this entire conversation has felt less like advice and more like a mirror, that's intentional. Because the truth is, most of the power you're looking for isn't external. It's in how you carry yourself when things shift. If you want women to miss you, become someone whose absence alters the room. And rooms are altered by gravity, not noise. Take a second and reflect on your own patterns. Where have you overextended? Where have you overreacted? Where have you stayed centered? That awareness alone will change how you move next time. And when you move differently, outcomes change without you forcing them. If this helped clarify something you've been sensing but couldn't articulate, Hit the like button so more men see it. Share it with someone who keeps chasing when they should be observing. And if you want deeper conversations like this, subscribe, because this isn't surface-level advice. It's slow realization, the kind that changes behavior quietly but permanently. At the end of the day, attraction isn't magic. It's response to energy. And when your energy stops chasing and starts leading itself, she feels it. She questions it. She recalibrates around it. That's when she begins to miss you. Not because you disappeared dramatically, but because you remained grounded while she expected you to scramble. And grounded men don't scramble.